Okay, so we're past 10. Apologies, everybody. I am Frida Wells, the Comms Engagement Advisor for the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee. So let's kick off. I'm not going to risk sharing my screen because we lost Iain's audio, and he is the audio we most want here. So kia ora koutou and welcome. This is our third thought leadership webinar with Dr. Iain White, which is being recorded. So firstly, I'd like to start with a karakia. Mōri ahau, mōri tū, mōri ora, kia tātou, haumie huie, taikie. So thank you for joining us today. We're honoured to have Iain here. His career is long and glowing, and he's asked me not to share it all, but I will say he's held in very high regard, not only for his academic work, but importantly for us, his generosity, connecting and communicating his work with the world. He's been interviewed by, well, everyone, The Guardian, BBC, Radio New Zealand, TVNZ, Don Post, New York Times. So don't hold back with your gnarliest questions for the Q&A. So a brief overview of why we're here today. You can find out more about the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee on our website. I prefer just to hand over to Iain. But essentially, we were formed under the Urban Growth Agenda, a government-wide program acknowledging that business as usual and the silos that we've built are no longer enough to deliver adequate solutions for the bigger systemic issues. We're a partnership of leaders in central government councils and iwi in the region, formed to work collaboratively to address our region's cross-boundary growth-related issues. Our goal is to positively shape the region's future, to take collective responsibility and all see our role in the problem as well as the solutions. We want our decisions today to stand up to the scrutiny of future generations. So collaboration is a constantly emerging and evolving way of working. So it's important to create these spaces to share best practice ideas and connect for the greater good. Finding the best pathway through the complexity of our region's issues invites us to be curious, coachable, and flexible to see that we're all connected. So these webinars are to connect us, keep the conversations going, hear from the experts, and learn together. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Iain White, whose talk today addresses the question, what do people really want from their neighbourhoods and cities? Looking into 20-minute city thinking. So just quickly, Dr. Iain White is a Professor of Environmental Planning at Waikato, where he's been since 2013. He's also the Associate Dean Research for Arts, Law, Psychology and Social Science. He was the Director of the Centre for Urban and Regional Ecology at the University of Manchester. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of the Sunshine Coast and an honorary senior research fellow at the University of Manchester. He's won numerous awards. He co-chairs the Australasian Cities Research Network, chairs the Hamilton Arts Trust, and is the author of over 4 books on environmental planning. I've probably gone on longer than you wanted me to, Iain. He's also a TED talker and is involved in leading or co-led over 20 research projects that are part of sometimes multi-million-dollar programs across the EU, government, non-profit and private sector. So I will stop there, and that is actually very shortened, and I will hand over to Iain.
Kia ora, Frida, and thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm hoping you can all see my slides now.
Yes.
Yeah, good. That's a relief. We've had a few technical problems this morning, so thank you for bearing with us. And thank you for the invitation. So just quickly, this is essentially about the 20-minute city and the story about how we've been trying to bring it to New Zealand, but also trying to put it in the political and policy context about why it's important and some of the issues to be aware of. And to present you some data from some research project that we've conducted. So this slide will give you a little bit of the overview of what we're coming down the track, but I thought I'd just start off with a definition in case people don't know what it is. And there's lots of different ways of talking about time and planning. There's 15-minute neighborhoods, 15-minute cities, 20-minute cities, 20-minute neighborhoods, but it's a similar kind of thing, really. And it's using time as opposed to proximity, which we do a lot in planning, to think about the distribution of amenities and environmental goods and access to services and that kind of thing. But that's the definition on the screen now, which I think is really useful. It's because it's given what giving you most, so not necessarily everything, giving you most of what you need for a good life. And I think a good life is a really good thing for planning to focus on within a 20-minute walk, cycle, or public transport trip from home. So we're going to talk briefly around some of the policy settings and the policy challenges, and then a bit of briefing around the principles and what it stands for, and then the findings from our research project about what people really want. So what comprises a good life for them. So just to start off with a few, this is the bit where I make everyone depressed, so apologies in advance. This is, we've got quite a lot of challenges in New Zealand. We've got a housing crisis, there's an infrastructure one, transport, and we tend to look at these in quite siloed ways. So you see that we've got around, housing density, housing affordability. There's a big gap in infrastructure planning, and we know that spatial planning is part of reducing the cost of that. So we can think about the number of users per amenity, for example. And we've had some really bad sort of trends with regard to our car use, which is really affecting our emissions and also the space that we use in cities. So some of those figures on number of vehicles in our fleet per 1,000 people and the vehicle kilometers traveled per person per year are all tracking in a direction we'd rather they didn't go in. So part of what we need to do in planning is try and think about these in less siloed ways, because that's essentially what spatial planning wants us to do. It wants us to think about integrated city regional thinking and planning. That's just the urban crises. So the environmental ones are really important too. This is, I think, one of the most important figures from the recent Climate Change Commission work. And it shows you what we've got to do, really. So you're looking at the various emissions in the various sectors. And the thing I want you to focus on in this talk is that blue sort of block there, which is transport. And then you look at the shape of that, and you see, well, it's not planning on really going down till about 2035. And it's not even going down that much at all. And I think we can do sort of much better than that. And you look at what New Zealand's trying to do on the whole, and they're not actually changing too much, but they're actually doing an awful lot of planting to offset and to provide the balance, which again is quite a risky strategy. So thinking about the climate change crisis and the need for transition is really important. And when you model these kind of things, you end up with, which is what we've done in some of our modeling, the transition towards electric vehicles. But while that might work from a modeling perspective, it's not actually very good from a planning perspective, because they still take up the same amount of physical space in our cities. They still demand the similar infrastructure, parking, roads. We still have safety issues and so on. So, what would be much better from my point of view is actually reducing those number of trips rather than switching from one mode to another. Now, I know the climate change models in the second iteration and the Climate Change Commission, they did actually include that. So that was a welcome sort of response to feedback. And then one other thing which came up in the Climate Change Commissions was it did actually mention sort of 15 or 20-minute cities, which was a really good thing to see. And this was a number of recommendations. There was a huge amount of recommendations in this report, actually. And this is just one. And I want you to just look at this one and imagine how difficult it is to do. And then you can times that by however many recommendations there was and think about the challenge that we've got. But we're thinking about retrofitting our urban spaces, which means that this is political. Anything about the allocation or reallocation of space ends up being pretty political. So one of the messages I really want to think about with regard to the transition is that it's not a technical exercise, it's quite a political one, and rethinking about our cities and the aspirations that we want. So trying to think about some of the challenges that we've got at the moment for policy is that the transition agenda is a lot easier to say than do, and it's particularly we want to transition to something better. And part of that's changing some of the narrative that we talk about change. So it's not just about growth or infrastructure or population in 2040. It's about improving people's lifestyles and that good life aspect that I mentioned. If you want to take people on a transition journey, which will be political, you've got to offer them something aspirational to to take them along with you. I think that the second point I want to make is that there's been a big focus in New Zealand, well, ever since I can remember. I've been here 9.5 years now, is that there's an awful lot of focus on numbers, quantity of dwellings, quantity of houses, population growth, and not as much discussion on the quality of places that we're creating. And it's quite good to see a discussion around good and bad density start to come out and how that is quite place specific. And so one of the rules of thumb that I think is quite useful is trying to think about neighborhood scales when we plan things, because this is where we can really bring that quality out to bear. And also it's about amenities, nature, health, well-being, those good life aspects that might not get captured if we think purely on numbers. I think the other big problem coming down the track, which we can see is starting to emerge, is that the national objectives are important around what we're trying to do within planning, but it's quite difficult actually taking communities with you on our journeys. So we know infill development is going to be controversial. And if you don't allow people, say in the formal planning process, which has been, the decision, and that there is some merit in that, considering some of the pushback, but politics will happen. And politics will either happen in a formal setting, and if you provide no space in the formal setting, it'll shift to the informal. And those will be the, they're quite sort of famous pictures we see of people with their arms crossed on the front page of Stuff, complaining about development, is that development is political. So you've got to think about how we develop in a way that really recognizes that the people's lives in these existing communities need to be enhanced too. And the last one, which is quite important for New Zealand, particularly given the pace and scale of the reform agenda, is that how do we do this in a way that makes sense for people? We need to, we've got an awful lot of new policy coming down the track. We know we've got particular demands. We know we've got to manage different scales as well. We've got to plan city regions as well as neighborhoods, and we've got to look at growth as well as local well-being. And thinking about the ways we can frame planning futures in a way that makes sense for people is really important. Because when people are being taken on this journey with you, they experience the day-to-day and they experience the smaller scale, whereas politicians do get pushed towards that 2030 sort of time scale. So that's some of the context, just to think about why this idea of a 20-minute city, I think, is really important and timely, and it does provide opportunities for cities or city regions if they want to seize that. So the background is that how it came to New Zealand is when COVID hit. Pretty soon after COVID, we had the Shovel Ready Fund that was announced by the government. And that was a way to sort of kickstart the economy, expecting the contraction and so on. And I worked with Hamilton City Council and Waka Kotahi in the Waikato region. And we came up with this idea to do something really ambitious. And we put in a bid with 2 weeks' notice for $500 million. But it was a partnership between the university, the city council, and the transport agency. And it was about the 20-minute city. And the idea was, it was to turn the city into a live experiment of urban change. So we had psychologists involved. We had, we were monitoring people's health and lifestyle and transition with trackers, and we could actually collect the much needed data that might underpin, the need for this transition. So it was actually really well regarded in the press. Someone sort of very kindly called it the gold standard of the things that were put in. It was really ambitious in hindsight, maybe a bit too much, because it didn't actually get funded. And I think And sometimes it's a lot easier to fund a $1 million project than a $500 million project. And I think it was maybe the timing wasn't right in hindsight, but we won the argument to do it even without the money. So I then wrote an article for Stuff to try and socialize the idea with Hamilton and Hamiltonians, and it got incredibly positive feedback. And I hear people in the council were getting phone calls about when's this happening, and the response was, well, it's not actually happening because we've not actually got the money yet. But the response was really positive, to the extent that the council decided actually we should transition to this idea of a 20-minute city. And so they put out their own press releases saying this is what we're trying to do now. This is part of our offering as a city. We're going to think through what it might look like, and we're going to use it to think about how we interpret some of the national objectives that are coming down the track. And that was just a few weeks later. It happened from a standing start to a few weeks later. And then 1 year later, it's now in the long-term plan and in the climate change plan. So it's starting those important steps of becoming embedded in the various sort of documentation, which is going to affect budgets and so on. So this is part of the context for Wellington, is that it's very transferable to different urban contexts. And I know you got the future development strategy being discussed, and you know, you've got the similar discussions around transport transition, livability, intensification, and thinking of a way to frame those debates and repackage them in a way that makes sense for people is really important. So just to take a step back now, if there's any planners in the audience, you'll probably be really familiar with this. This is probably one of the most famous sort of planning images ever, which is Ebenezer Howard's on Garden Cities. And this predates the car, but it's essentially, you know, it chimes with what we're trying to do now with 20-minute city think, which is providing self-contained areas, which actually reduces the need to travel between them. Anyone who trained as a planner in the 90s, like I did, might recognize sort of issues around new urbanism, which started things around walkable neighborhoods, 5-minute walks, mixed-use zoning to try and break up those journeys between zones. This was really important in the UK towards an urban renaissance. It really gives an idea of these different scales, each functioning and performing different amenities and services for populations. So the point I'm making here is that it's not necessarily new. It's what good planning should have always been. It is thinking about access to various amenities and goods and reducing, you know, some of the environmental bads that we might experience as a result. More recently, Portland really led the thinking on 20-minute neighborhoods. You can see their approach there, which is a bit of a heat map, sort of amenity kind of approach. Melbourne have done the most internationally in embedding this in a policy environment. And then Paris have done the most in actually turning this into a political project and a climate change project and bringing people with you. So even though they're not as advanced as Melbourne, they've actually got a much higher branding for it. And you see it's actually part of the branding of the city now. Because that's the other important thing. This is almost a contract that if you move to the city, this is the kind of lifestyle we'll try to give you. And that can be attractive, particularly to certain groups. So these are the benefits. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into these because they're becoming sort of quite well known in the literature. But the idea is that there's economic benefits, which are basically around agglomeration. Social benefits around cohesion and walkability, and health benefits around sort of that more active travel, and environmental benefits such as around think about CO2 emissions and transport and so on. But there's actually, from a research perspective, there's a lot of claims here, and we're a bit evidence light on some of these, and so there's a real need to backfill some of these evidences, particularly in an Aotearoa context, to try and think about what this might look like. So I'm not going to sum up some of the research questions, so these are the things to be aware of. going into this agenda with our eyes open might be a different way of thinking about it, is that there's a long history in planning of experts coming in and doing things to communities. Particularly taking ideas from elsewhere and just plonking them down in countries which is a different context. And that's, there's a long history and a long literature about why we need to be careful about applying ideas from elsewhere. And so thinking about how we might do this in an Aotearoa context is really important. And it's not, it's not necessarily a top-down technical strategy if it's going to affect people's lives too as well. So we've got to talk to people and find out, do you actually want this kind of lifestyle? Are we just experts assuming what my impression of a good life is and then just projecting it onto others? The second one is that when we look at these agendas, and you saw it on the Melbourne and the Paris maps, is that they tend to just look at everything as having the same gravitational pull, the same attractiveness. So 15 minutes from work, 15 minutes from play, 15 minutes from employment or leisure or shopping. But in reality, it's not like that. There are some things you want to be closer to more than others, and some things you don't mind being a bit of a distance away because you just don't use them that often. So we need more granular data on the different attractiveness of different services and amenities in order to sort of think about what we might want to do first. The third one, again, is about difference, is that we need to recognize that there's difference in age, gender, abilities, and so on. And how does this idea of a 20-minute city translate to different groups in different ways? And how can we pull out that data and understand how it might change over time, over age, over gender, and or even time of day? And the last one is, should it even be 20 minutes? So this is something we scratched our heads around in Hamilton when we put the original bid together, is that, should it be 15? Should it be 25? Should it be neighborhood? Should it be city? And we actually planned for 20-minute city, thinking about what we know about Hamilton and its urban form. And so one of the things we wanted to backfill was actually the right, did we pick well, or should it be a different time frame? So now I'm going to tell you some of those answers of what we've found out. So we really, in order to find those out, we designed a national survey, and I want to just give a shout out to the fellow researchers on the project, all from Waikato: Sylvia Sarah Norman, Kate Matness, Shin Yu Chu, Catherine Edwards, and Juliana Ray Junquera. And we put together a project which is essentially a national survey on what you prefer to live close to, and how long would you travel together, and how that might differ over time. We got a lot of a really good response. Really pleased with the level of response we got overall. Quite a good age spread as well. So we know that, in comparison to some of the surveys researchers do, this is actually pretty good data and pretty robust. And now, okay, the big reveal for some of the questions. So should it be 20 minutes? How does this differ between age? And also we asked, it's not just walkability, it's cycling and also micro mobility as well. So we asked the same question for all three modes. So basically, yes, 20 minutes was a really good idea. So what that graph is telling you is that you've got the age on the side of the screen. And then the question was, what's your preferred maximum travel time to, and we had a list of amenities, and this is averaged. So what you're seeing there is that that's the maximum time for a single journey. So one direction, not a return journey. So it looks a bit bigger than we might use for some of the walkability or walkable catchments data, for example. So the key messages from this is that time seemed to resonate with people, and people understood time as a good way to think about it. And the way the other good rule of thumb is time was the same pretty much whether you're walking, cycling, or micro mobility. it was a very consistent time period you wanted to spend getting to your destination. So that idea of time is a really good rule of thumb, and you just might vary the distance compared to how fast you can go in that time. But it's such a a good planning rule. And the way I think about it is not necessarily that this is the preferred distance. This is the maximum travel time. So after this, car use becomes dominant. Once access to amenities gets above this, people will not walk to places. And I think the other key point is that we don't have to aim for this. Low is obviously better. But this is the maximum. We didn't ask people the preferred time because you just get 1 minute. So this was trying to think through about where does that switch in thresholds between modes occur. Next question, how does this differ by gender and location? So you'll see here, same question, is that generally speaking, females will spend a little bit more time traveling to places than males. I'll go into why that might be the case in a little bit. And by location, you'll see that Hamilton will walk a bit further or spend a bit more time traveling than Wellington, and Auckland is the least. But it's, I think, I mean, we didn't ask why this was the case, but the working hypothesis that we think probably makes most sense is that it's not that they want to spend, or females want to spend more time walking. They're just used to being poorly served by planning. And they're used to having to go further and spend more time getting to where they want to go. And it's quite similar between Auckland and Hamilton. There's a bigger density of amenities around Auckland and Hamilton. And so you're used to things being closer. So it might be that people are more used to having better access to amenities, but really, there's not a lot of difference nationally. And the national figure, so this is Aotearoa wide average for all amenities of how long you want to get there. You're looking about 18.5 minutes. And that's the threshold after which you'll switch to car use. And that's one way. So roughly about 1.5K-ish as a rule of thumb. Okay. Now we asked the question about day and night because it doesn't get captured in a lot of these analyses, and we thought it was really interesting because everyone's travel behavior changes over time, and particularly if you feel like you're not safe. And so we asked people, how does this change? How does your travel behavior change when things get dark? And we found out that basically your 20-minute city becomes a car-dominated city at night if you're not thinking about really good urban design. So this idea of a rhythm to the day where we might have a more more walkable catchments and then more drivable catchments, and how do you extend that with thinking around investment into safety, lighting, good design, eyes on the street, and so on. And then this is the reveal, which probably is the most surprising bit of the data that we found is we asked everyone, what amenities do you prefer the most? And there was a list. What do you want to live, what do you want to live closest to or prefer the most? And then there was 3 that they went down. So they picked the top 3 and then we aggregated this, and you'll see nationwide, this is, people want 2 things more than anything else. They want nature parks and gardens, and they want local shops and services. So it doesn't matter who we asked. I mean, they really differed the age. It was everywhere. It was a really, really strong, clear finding is that what people want from a good life, 50% of the time, is 2 things. So, so the way I think about it now is a good strategy, a good way to start this agenda is to engage with nature parks and gardens and local shops and services. Because people clearly value that, and that's part of what makes up a good life for them. And then the other thing which is quite important, when you shift from time to proximity, you just see the streetscape differently. So if you're going to think about, how many people have a 20 minutes away from nature parks and gardens, then if you have a road that cuts through with, a number of crossings that people have to wait for, you're reducing the size of that catchment. So by reprioritizing the urban form, you're actually extending the time and the number of people that can hit those same amenities without investing in new amenities. So a good way to save money on providing new amenities is to think about the prioritization of time and increasing that walkable catchment scale. How does that differ by age? There was a little bit of difference. So everyone of every age picks local shops and services. The young picks education, perhaps not surprisingly, and then nature parks and gardens. And nature parks and gardens were the top two around the middle. And then towards the end, we see the desirability of larger shopping complexes you can drive to perhaps and park. But it was quite an anomaly that it was concentrated in that sort of older generation who wanted those things. We didn't see that anywhere else in the data. So no matter what age group you're thinking of, it was always, local shops and services was always top, and nature parks and gardens was always, in the top three. So thinking about what this might mean for planning is, have we planned for these enough in the past? Have we undervalued these in some of our thinking? If people are telling us that that's what they value as part of their good life, then maybe we should respond to that. And I think the second one is that, what does this mean for our sort of conceptualization of what planning is or should be? And I've been thinking around this. We did do the survey during COVID. And I wonder if that idea of this rebirth of localism did come through quite strongly, and people valued their local areas a lot more. And this idea of polycentric urban form, which was something I remember being taught sort of 25 years ago, which is maybe coming back. And this idea of these sort of neighborhood catchment scales, which can perform sort of multiple functions for populations. So that 20-minute neighborhood idea. So last slide now, and thank you for bearing with me, is I just wanted to just try and go back to the big picture now about what we've learned and why this might be something that you could consider engaging with in the Wellington region. And I think the first thing I want to make is that this is not a technical project, even though it's seen, and in some ways that it could be when you'll start to measure in distance and so on. But this is an opportunity to rebrand a place around the idea of a good life. If you move to Wellington, this is what we'll offer you. This is our commitment for the lifestyle we'll give you. This is what we value. And if you value these things too, you should maybe live or invest here. So it's not a technical exercise in city planning. It's actually quite a political exercise or it could be, in what, how we might reposition our offering as a place. The second major thing is that it's really, I've been surprised how effective the frame is at integrating different aspects of policy. So I ran a workshop with Hamilton City Council and some of their senior managers, and there's people there from various different departments, and everyone understood what it was trying to do. So the transport people got it, the parks people got it, and all the different bits got it. So it's a good way to get integration and coordination across, an institution, and also externally beyond it as well. The other thing I think is good, it's a really good way to engage citizens with some of the difficult conversations we've got to have. It allows, so part of the the position we took in Hamilton, it's do you want a 20-minute city? Is this the kind of thing that you think we should pursue? And there was a really good feedback and the local plan submissions and so on. Okay, And then that opens up actually really good conversations that if you want us to do this, would you support us to implement the policies that makes this more likely? And that might involve changes to parking or pedestrianisation or street space, etc. So it allows a different way to have the same conversations. And the last one, which is I'll put in because I know it's at the forefront of some of the politicians' minds, is it doesn't have to cost any more money than what you're doing now. It's essentially reallocation of existing budgets and a realignment of what you want to do. So it can be completely cost neutral. And I think we're a bit delayed, so I've overrun a little bit, so sorry about that. But that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to answer any questions as we go, and thank you for listening and tuning in.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Iain. So I'm just going to open it up to Q&A. So please, you can use the chat or...
So I guess many of us here might be involved in our future development strategy, which you mentioned too in your presentation. Just wondering, have you got, so that's well sort of underway at this point, and we're plugging in all the kind of data for the scenarios, etc. But have you got any tips, any suggestions as to how we might be able to integrate this kind of frame of thinking into that process, for example?
Yeah, so one of the discussions we had with Hamilton was how big do we go when we don't have all the evidence yet, and so what the decision was made to make it to put it as an aspiration almost in the vision, is that it's part of the high level vision and position of a place under which we can, our aspiration is to align various policy. It might take some time. And so part of the way to start, I think, is winning the political argument, that this is something that is attractive for the region, and then embedding that vision within policy documents and trying to not do everything at once. We don't have to realign everything. You've got to really engage with the people around what is important for this particular place as well. So part of what I think is important is thinking about some easy wins, which are around access to natural green space. I mean, we're quite fortunate in Aotearoa to have things like gully networks, which can be peppered around an urban farm, which actually means that you might already have it without realizing once you actually do some of the mapping and the time and local shops. And then a lot of what local government do is actually, some of the public realm works is thinking around the reprioritization of street space and walkability, which is what you're doing anyway, or a lot of places are. So reprioritizing that in order so more people can access the same amenity in the same amount of time, which I think is, I mean, you're basically reframing some of the existing conversations and you're tying them together in a way which might make sense overall. I think the other good thing about it, which I think is, we don't talk about enough, is it's a real good way to look at equity within a city. You can look at who doesn't have access to areas and which areas could then be a priority for new playgrounds or new parks or those areas, or which might you actually increase mobility in those areas so they can access what's already there existing. Okay, what about clusters to health services? So Ellen Davidson, has that featured in survey feedback? It did. It did a little bit, and particularly as you get a bit older, as you imagine, there was no surprises. But the thing I want to flag up is that in Australia, health has been the key reason that has driven this agenda. In Aotearoa, it might be transport or elsewhere, but the Heart Foundation Australia have paired up with Melbourne City Council because they see this as a route to reduce their bills around active travel and health and achieve some of their goals. So it's a really good way to try and get synergies between institutions aligned around a particular goal. So I think because a lot of it is around active travel, there's huge links to health, and we haven't yet made enough about that yet. Angela Berg, is there a report that we will publish that covers the findings of the survey? Yeah, so happy to send you what we have. I see this as completely shareable and open. I just want the evidence to influence. So the intention is that we'll write this up into an academic paper, which is what we're told to do at work. But we've also happy to share the data in a more sort of policy briefing format. So we've got a document which is like a PDF, which is just key messages, which I think we've got available, and happy to share that with everybody. But basically, yeah, happy to share anything because we're all a bit evidence light in this space. Angela Bell, to what extent do you think the preference for local parks is a reflection of people's inclination to use active transport? Are they more willing to walk to a park than to their job? Maybe, yeah, good question. We didn't ask sort of those in-depth questions. That could be a next phase in the research, is to find out why. So we don't actually know why people prefer what they do. We can make assumptions over their age or and what that might be, but that was basically the next sort of phase of this research. Angela Sutherland, are you aware of any similar research using demographics other than age and data in cases of socioeconomic vulnerability, cultural background? We started to do this, and but I don't think we had a rich enough data at this scale of socioeconomic data in order to really make it robust. We did a few layers, and so part of my thinking is that I have, my hypothesis is that lower, most socioeconomic vulnerable areas would have less access to services and amenities. And we looked at that, and it did look like that could be the case, but we weren't confident enough that we had the data set to basically tell particular stories about that. But that could be something that definitely happens. So Paul Cost, do you think the effects-based planning approach helps us or hinders just to achieve 20 minutes? Hinders, this is quite a, the way I see this is it's a vision-led sort of spatial planning, almost as social contracts, that this is what we'll try and do in a place. And effects-based, it's a different ideology that is probably less coherent with regard to a place than something like this could be. So yeah, I'm hopeful the shift to spatial planning and some of the policy reform agenda sort of will help us sort of engage with this, but it's still, it still could be pushed more in the reform agenda or some of the climate change work. It's still quite, you could do it if you want to, but we're not going to tell you how to do it. Andrew Wharton, your research aligned to Wellington City 2019 research on a strong preference for urban growth around existing suburban centres and central city walking distance shops and services. Yeah, I think there's a few bits of data that coming together that I think people don't want to spend a long time commuting in a car to a central agglomeration economy. I think there's, the things around polycentric urban form, walking distance, hierarchy of neighbourhood centres is quite an attractive offering for many people. And so thinking around directing growth and density around those nodes makes an awful lot of sense, because you then have got the number of people in order to justify the extra investment in additional amenities for those populations as well. So part of the problem with this is you can't just promise everything to everyone everywhere. We just don't have the money. And so you either think about what are the low-hanging fruit that you could do as a base layer, such as nature, access to nature or local shops, for example. But then you're thinking around, if you want access to more of these, then you might have to live closer to our neighborhood centers. And so it's not giving everyone access to the same amount of things, I don't think. So I quickly ran through those, and thanks for tuning and engaging.
It looks like there's no more questions. I'll make a final comment before I hand over to Dr. Catherine Knight for our closing. I'm just curious, Iain, your reflections on if you've lived or visited overseas for substantial amounts of time, if you feel like when you come back to New Zealand, we are maturing and creaking at the seams, shifting from being so used to having as much space as we wanted to having to share. And I've gone to European cities where no one really complains or questions, the train, the density of housing, the shared spaces, because that's their normal. So it's sort of like we're moving to a new normal. I'm not sure your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm not sure how different we are in a lot of ways. We did a research recently with colleagues in Australia and the UK and looked at this shift as COVID, the shift towards innovating streets agenda happened in multiple countries at the same time. So we analyzed the pushback, and it was exactly the same. It doesn't matter where you are. People don't like things being taken away from them, particularly without an engagement strategy. The other flaw with that approach was that it wasn't part of a network. It was a street. Really, you've got to provide a network-based approach to get change on scale. You needed an innovating city approach, or a different way to put it, or else your street just ends up going into the next street. So yeah, in New Zealand, we do have a particular history of planning where we've had quite a lot of space to deal with or to manage, and there has been a lot of we have done quite a sprawly development pattern over time, unless there was geographical constraints, just as a coast or mountains, hills. But it also gives us opportunities, because I look at the streetscape in New Zealand and I see space to retrofit, which you don't get in European cities. You've got these really wide verges. You've got the roads are quite wide compared to some of the sort of skinnier streets elsewhere. So I think what we've done in the past, some people might say, well, that's not been very sustainable for an urban farm perspective, but it actually now has created some chances to retrofit sustainability back in the urban farm, because we're not as constrained spatially as they are in other countries. So I know one thing that Hamilton, they're looking at the verges to provide rain gardens, for example, and look at some of the services that are going in that public realm that might not happen on the actual site because of the density requirements. So there are opportunities with the way that we've used space as well.
So I'll just make a few closing remarks, and I'll keep this really quick, because I'm really conscious that we've run over time. So thank you, Iain, so much for that thought-provoking presentation. I think you've left us with plenty to think about, and perhaps even more importantly, you've provided us with a shared language and body of evidence which we can build on in our various areas of work. For me, the appeal of the 20-minute city thinking is twofold, and both points you have amply illustrated in your talk. One is that this framework encourages systems thinking, breaking down barriers between our respective silos and working across planning, infrastructure, transport policy, and so on to create the possibility of a different future for our cities and neighbourhoods, and at the same time helping to address many of our biggest and most urgent issues. It provides, I think, for an example of a blueprint for transitioning our communities to a low carbon future through a strengthened sense of community, of connection with place and nature, and thriving local economies. In other words, through enhanced community and individual well-being. And secondly, the attraction for me of this approach is that it encourages us to see social well-being at the fulcrum of what we do. It does this by asking that fundamental question: what do you need to live a good life? And it is especially wonderful to see, as someone passionate about the link between nature and well-being, the high value placed on green space alongside local shops and services by your survey respondents. So I can visualize it now, all the contented people walking or biking along tree-lined paths to their local greengrocer and baker, serenaded all the way by birdsong to pick up a basket full of locally made goodies for their evening meal or weekend brunch. So once again, thank you, Iain, for your talk, and thank you to Frida and the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee for offering this valuable opportunity to learn and to share ideas. And I know the seminar series is ongoing, and there'll be plenty more learning opportunities, and this is just the beginning of the conversation. And I know that Frida would love to hear from you if you've got any topics you would like to cover in a future seminar. But again, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.